I'm taking care of a local farm for a few weeks. They left me a strange set of rules. Part 1. A few miles north of me, there's a little family-owned farm. The family takes a vacation in July, though, and they posted a job listing for a caretaker. My job would include feeding the animals, making sure the irrigation was working, and harvesting some crops. It's a small operation, so it's not fields and fields of stuff. Plus, they were offering $2,000. At the time, that seemed like an amazing deal. Now, I'm not so sure. See, the Gershons gave me detailed instructions in the envelope and half of the stipend. And as I sat down to read it, I realized that it sounded a little strange. Dear Emily, thank you for taking care of our farm. To ensure your safety and happiness, and the animals, we've included a list of instructions and tasks. 1. Please feed the goats and chickens at 6 a.m. sharp. They get pretty cranky if it's not on time, smiley face. 2. You will need to prune off the floricans in the raspberry patch. To do this, cut the canes, branches, that are woody and have already fruited. Wear thick gloves because there are thorns. If you do get cut, immediately head inside and call Dr. Livesey to make sure your wound is not infected. 3. The sunflower field is easy to maintain and brings beauty to our farm. However, if you ever see a sunflower that isn't facing the same direction as the others, immediately head inside. Do not return to the sunflower field until the following day. 4. The farm is, as you know, surrounded by forest. Sometimes we get coyotes, foxes, or other wild animals prowling about the grounds at night. Don't worry, the animal pens are completely secure and there is no need to check on the animals if you hear anything at night. We recommend you do not leave the farmhouse between sunset and sunrise. 5. Do not enter the corn maze. Even if you hear noises coming from the maze that sound like a child crying, do not enter. The corn maze is not open to visitors yet. It's most likely the bobcats in the woods. 6. Do not be alarmed if you see the goats awake in the middle of the night. They are semi-nocturnal and often wake up to roam, graze, or use the bathroom. 7. You may help yourself to any of the fruits or vegetables you harvest. However, do not eat the apples from the northwest corner of the orchard. 8. We no longer use scarecrows. If you see one, please return to the house, lock all the doors, and close all the curtains. Stay inside until the following morning. 9. Always stock the farm stand twice a day, in the morning and again in the afternoon. At night, take all unsold produce inside and store it in the refrigerator. 10. We do not own any pigs. Thank you so very much, Emily. The Gershon. I glanced out the window. The sun was hanging low over the trees, orange rays filtering through the forest. Damn it, if I'm not supposed to be out after dark because of the wolves or whatever, I better get cracking. I walked over to the goats first. They huddled close to me as I filled their food bins, staring at me with their weird slit pupils. I tried to get it done as quickly as possible. Goats, honestly, freaked me out a little bit. As I hurried away, one with black and white fur pushed its little face through the fence. Maia, it bleated, staring at me. The chickens were more skeptical of me, staring at me and letting out long backs as they bobbed their heads. As soon as they realized I had food, though, they came over and pecked the ground. They were pretty cute. I locked the gate and turned back towards the house. I froze. Across the field from me stood the field of sunflowers. Bright golden petals and dark centers swaying slightly in the wind. But while all of them tilted away from me, facing the dying sun, One of them, near the edge of the field, was instead facing me. I stared at its pitch black center. Didn't the note say something about that? Go inside if one of the sunflowers is pointing a different way. I locked up the chicken gate. Then I strode across the grass towards the old farmhouse, still carrying the bag of chicken feed. I was halfway to the house when I turned around again. I wish I hadn't. The sunflower was still facing me, even though, based on my path, it shouldn't have been. I picked up my pace towards the house. Oh, come on, what do you think's gonna happen? That sunflower is gonna chase after you and murder you? My brain knew it was stupid, but there was something instinctual, a gut feeling, that forced my legs to pump harder. I didn't even bother dropping the feed off at the shed. I raced into the house and locked all the doors. Phew. Safe. I took a final glance out at the sunflower. Then I went into the tiny kitchen and started some water boiling for pasta. By the time I was sitting down to eat, I was shaking my head. So stupid. Afraid of a sunflower. Something woke me up in the middle of the night. I sat up, my neck aching from the crappy pillow they'd left for me. I looked around my tiny bedroom, but nothing seemed amiss. Well, of course, there were things amiss, like the peeling paint, the light bulb that flickered, and the clogged toilet. But nothing different. I yawned and checked my phone. 3:12 a.m. Sighing, I settled back into sleep. But before I drifted off, I heard it. A small, high-pitched noise. Coming from outside. I slowly forced myself out of bed and walked over to the window. Underneath me, the farm sprawled out into the darkness, but it was distorted in the old glass, shapes, and colors bleeding into each other like running paint. I flipped the window lock and pushed it open, the wood squeaking loudly in my ears. I listened. Silence. Then, help me. A voice. A child's voice. Coming from the direction of the cornfield. That's no fucking bobcat. My blood ran cold. I stared out into the darkness at the cornfield on the edge of the woods. I was hoping that it was just some lingering dream or something. But as I stood there, the cool summer breeze wafting into the room, I heard it again. Please. Help me. The voice wavered as if the child was crying. I squinted into the darkness, staring at the cornfield. I have to go out there. I remembered the Gershon's rule, but there was no way this was an animal. Hey! I'm coming, don't worry. I shouted out the window. Silence. And then a rustling sound. I squinted at the cornfield, and I could see the stalks moving as something moved within them. Stay where you are. I shouted into the darkness. I'm coming to get you. The cornstalks continued to move, and every muscle in my body froze. The amount of corn moving, there was no way it was just a small child in there. The corn was swaying, dancing, roiling in an area maybe 10 feet across. And it was making its way towards the edge of the field. Rapidly. I shut the window. Then I closed the blinds, my heart hammering in my chest. I raced downstairs and checked the locks. And then, finally, when I was sure I was safe, I called the police. But they wouldn't even come out. There are no missing children in the area, and what you saw was most likely a bear, they explained calmly. I think they must know all about the Gershon's farm. So now I lie here, in my bed, listening to the snaps and rustles of the cornstalks. There is a chair wedged under my doorknob. I've triple-checked all the locks. And all I can do is wait for dawn. I'm taking care of a local farm for a few weeks. They left me a strange set of rules. Part 2. 6 a.m. came all too early. The alarm blared in my ears, and I forced myself out of bed, groaning. The sun had just crested over the hill, and the sky was lit with the pale gray of dawn. I could hear the rooster crowing already. I looked out the window, scanned the farm, but everything looked normal. All the sunflowers were facing halfway towards me, in the direction of the rising sun. The cornfield was still. The chickens were milling about the coop, pecking the ground. I went downstairs, grabbed the bag of feed I'd never put away, and went out to the coop. The chickens were probably the only part of the farm I liked. The fat little hens ran towards me as I poured the food onto the ground. Making happy noises, they pecked it up. I locked the gate and started over the hill, towards the shed, to get the goat feed. That's when I heard it. Oink! I stopped in my tracks. The Gershon's note said they didn't own any pigs. Oink! The note didn't say anything about avoiding the pigs, though. So I was free to go fetch the goat feed. Right? I started walking again, up the hill. Oink! And that's when I realized there was something off about the sound. It almost sounded human. Like a person saying oink instead of an actual animal sound. For a second, I had a weird mental image of a naked man covered in his filth, crouching on the ground, saying oink over and over. Oink! I shook my head and continued up the hill. And when I got to the top, I saw the source of the noise, a fat, pink pig, standing in the grass. I let out a breath of relief. See? It's just an ordinary pig. I passed the pig, ignoring it completely, and opened the shed. Put the chicken feed back. Pulled out the goat feed. Started back up the hill. I stopped dead as my eyes fell on the pig. Its face. It almost looked human. Its fleshy, pink snout was shorter than it should be. Its curled little ears sat low and flat on its head. And its eyes, they weren't round and beady, but almond-shaped, like a person's. With dark pupils that stared up at me in a way that suggested intelligence. The feed bag fell out of my hands. I stumbled back. But the pig didn't advance. It just stared at me with its human eyes. I backed away, keeping my eyes on it. Slowly walked around it so that I was going back towards the house. When I got over the hill, and that horrible little face was finally out of my sight, I whipped around and broke into a run. What the fuck was that? I panted to myself as I locked the front door behind me. Not knowing what else to do, I pulled out my phone and called the police. But when they picked up, I wasn't sure what to say. I started. Found a pig that doesn't look like a pig. On the farm. The Gershon's farm. Did you touch the pig? The officer cut in. What? Did you have any contact with the pig? Any at all? No. Good. We'll send an officer out to deal with it. 15 minutes later, I saw a police car pull up the driveway. They asked me where I'd seen it, then told me to stay inside. I went over to the window and watched them walk up the hill, then disappear. A minute passed, then a shrill squeal erupted in the silence. 5 minutes later, the officers reappeared, carrying a large black plastic bag that swung with each step. Hey, hey! I called out as they headed for the cruiser. What was that thing? The officers glanced at each other. Rabies, the female officer said, while the male stuffed the bag into the back seat. A bunch of rabid pigs have been showing up in this area. Gonna send it off to get tested. Good thing you didn't touch it." Before I could ask her more questions, she hopped onto the driver's side. And then they were gone. I stared out the window, utterly perplexed. Why didn't the Gershons tell me to stay away from the pigs? After the debacle with the pig, I decided to take it easy. I made a wholesome breakfast, read a few chapters of the thriller I was working through, and called my boyfriend. Around 11 a.m., though, I realized I'd forgotten to stock the farm stand. It was still technically morning, so I ran out into the field, filled my hod with zucchini and tomatoes, and ran down the driveway as fast as I could without spilling any of the produce. But as the little farm stand came into view, I saw that there was already someone waiting. I checked my watch at 11:49 a.m. "I'm so sorry," I breathed as I spread the produce out on the wooden table. I was supposed to get this out earlier, but there was a pig, and something made me stop rambling. I glanced up to see that the person standing there was a little odd. He was an old man, probably about 6 feet tall, and very thin. He wore, surprisingly, a crisp black suit and an old-timey bowler hat in the sweltering heat. He was smiling at me, but his teeth were deeply yellow and crooked, and his eyes were sunken back in his skull. Nothing unnatural about him, just a slightly creepy-looking old guy, but in a way, he reminded me of the creepy dudes from that one Buffy the Vampire episode where they take away everyone's voices. "So, what are you looking for today?" I asked when he didn't move to take any of the produce. "The Gershons aren't here?" I shook my head. "Won't be back for 2 weeks. He said, thoughtfully. "They didn't tell me they were leaving." "Oh, you know them?" He let out a small chuckle. "You could say that." I waited for him to either take produce or leave. But he didn't do either. He just stood there, looking at me. The way his blue eyes cut into mine made a chill run down my spine. It wasn't a predatory or sexual stare. It felt more like he was examining me, studying me, trying to read every tilt of my head and blink of my eyes. It made me extremely uncomfortable. "So, are you interested in any of this?" "The tomatoes look good today," I said, trying to not sound nervous. "Or if you're looking for something else, I can go pick it for you. Only the Gershons can provide what I'm looking for." "Okay, well, I'm going back up to the farm. If you change your mind, the prices are listed on the whiteboard, and you just leave the money in the box." I shot him a fake smile, turned around, and headed up the hill as quickly as I could without seeming weird. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. "Emily?" I never told him my name. The smartest thing would have been to run. But instead, I turned around. He wasn't chasing me. He was still standing at the farm stand, 10 yards from me. "I wouldn't trust the Gershons if I were you," he called out. Then he turned on his heel and strode away. As I watched him go, I realized there wasn't any car parked at the bottom of the driveway. He just turned onto the old country road and walked away. I watched him until he rounded the bend and disappeared. I retreated into the house, checked all the locks, and decided I would spend the rest of the day inside, at least, until it was time to feed the animals and stock the farm stand again. I'm taking care of a local farm for a few weeks. They left me a strange set of rules. Part 3. When I fed the goats that evening, they still seemed mad at me from the morning. With all the pig business, I hadn't gotten their morning meal to them until nearly 10 a.m., and as I entered the pen, they eyed me warily. Maia, a brown one, bleated, with a look of betrayal in its slit-pupil eyes. My last task of the day was picking up the unsold produce. I hurried down the driveway, garden hot in my arms, an audiobook playing through my earbuds. The sun hung low in the sky, casting shadows that stretched across the driveway before me. The sun wasn't setting yet, that wouldn't be for another hour, but it still made me nervous. Most of the produce was gone, but I grabbed the 3 remaining zucchini and put them in the hod. Then I turned around and hurried back up the hill as fast as I could. But when I crested the hill, I saw something in the fields that made my heart stop. A scarecrow. Its arms stretched out at its sides. Its head hung limply on its shoulders. I couldn't see it in detail, it was too far away, but I could see its silhouette. I immediately broke into a sprint. Just get inside. You'll be fine. I focused on the white door. It was still so far away. But I forced myself to stare at it, to keep my eyes away from the scarecrow. Just run. As fast as you can. And I made it. I slammed the door shut. Drew the deadbolt. Closed all the curtains. Checked all the other locks. And then I collapsed onto the couch and called my boyfriend, Derek. You have to come here, I told him. There's someone out there, and I ran inside, but I think I rambled on in incoherent sentences until he interrupted me. Wait, slow down. You think there's someone out there? Yes. Are you sure? Derek was a good man. But he often thought I was being a little too paranoid, a little too scared. When I insisted I was being followed home from work, he told me it was probably nothing, and just some guy walking the same route as me. When I heard sounds in the middle of the night, he insisted it was the house settling. When I watched true crime shows and told him how we need to do X or Y so we don't fall victim to a crime like that, he'd just laugh. It wasn't intentionally mean, but in these moments it was painfully obvious he'd grown up as a man, with little to be afraid of in this world. Yes, I'm sure. They said the farm doesn't use scarecrows, and there is a fucking scarecrow standing on the hill. Watching me. I heard a loud sigh on the other end. Are you saying you don't believe me? I didn't say anything, he said, calmly. You sighed. Okay. Sorry. It's just, this sounds really, he trailed off. Never mind. Please, just come over here. I'll explain everything. Why don't you come over here? Because if I go outside, the scarecrow will get me. Silence. And then I realized that sentence did sound pretty unhinged on its own. Listen, there's been really weird stuff happening on this farm. And then I launched into an explanation of everything, the list of rules, the sunflowers, the cornfield, even the pig man. Why didn't you tell me all this earlier? He asked when I'd finished. Because you wouldn't believe me. You still don't. I'm trying to. This sounds like a lot of ghost story type stuff, you know? Another sigh. But look, I can tell you're upset. I'm coming over, okay? I'm leaving right now. Be there in a half hour. I ended the call and stared at the curtains. For a minute, I was tempted to part them, to make sure the scarecrow hadn't gotten closer, but I wasn't going to disobey the rules. When Derek arrived, I took every precaution to get him inside safely. I told him to park as close to the house as possible, look around for scarecrows, and then run as fast as he could. As soon as he was inside safely, my fear melted away. We put on a movie, had some good laughs, and then went to bed. But around 2 a.m., something woke me with a start. And when I sat up, I realized Derek was gone. Derek? I called out, walking into the hallway. Where are you? When he didn't reply, I walked downstairs. I found him standing in front of the window, peering outside. "Hey!" I hissed. "You're not supposed to look outside." SSH. There's someone out there. My blood ran cold. I joined him at the window and scanned the fields. I don't see anyone. No. There was someone out there. His fingers inched towards his belt, and my heart plummeted when I saw the shiny black metal sticking out of his pocket. "You brought your gun?" "You said you were scared," he whispered back. "You said someone was out there. I didn't believe you, but now I do. Aren't you glad I brought it?" "No. I never want to be near that thing." "Okay. We can have some stupid debate about gun rights later. Right now, there's someone out there. And if we just go back to sleep, we might not wake up in the morning." "Derek, I'm just telling it like it is." I crossed my arms and stared out into the fields with him. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A shadowy figure walking along the edge of the sunflower field. Derek didn't waste any time. He unbolted the door and swung it open. "Hey! You! Get off our property! I've got a gun!" The figure stopped, paused, and then sidestepped into the sunflowers. Before I could stop him, Derek ran out of the house. "Derek!" I shouted, but he didn't stop. I paused at the threshold, and then I sprinted out after him. "Come back!" Fuck. He was running straight for the sunflower field. "Don't go in there." He probably wouldn't have even stopped. But when he got to the border, I screamed bloody murder at him, and he stopped for just a moment. "You can't go in there," I panted, grabbing his arm. "The sunflowers." "Yeah, you told me. They're evil or watch you or something. I think I can handle myself." He gestured to his gun. "And if I don't scare this fucker, he's going to come back and rape or murder or do whatever he came here to do." With that, he disappeared into the foliage. I stood there, panting, at the border of the field. "He'll be okay," I lied to myself. "He'll be okay." As the adrenaline faded, I lifted my head and scanned the flowers. They were all turned towards me, yellow petals appearing silver in the light of the full moon. Okay. It's okay. They're all pointing in the same direction. See? Wait. There was a single flower in the center of the field, turned away from me. My blood ran cold. "Derek, come out of there." Silence. No pounding footsteps, no rustling, nothing. A chill ran over my body. "Please, come out," I begged, staring into the shadowy darkness under the flowers. And then I heard it. "Help!" Derek's voice. Strangled, in pain. I reacted instinctively. My feet hit the dirt and I stumbled into the darkness. Leaves brushed my body and scratched at my arms. "Derek?" I called. The sunflowers stretched up, 6 or 7 feet tall, their moonlit heads swaying in the breeze above me. I turned a full circle, looking in every direction for Derek, but all I saw were more stems, more leaves, more inky black shadows. "Derek? Where are you?" I stopped walking and listened, straining my ears for any sort of sound. And then, after several seconds, I heard something, a soft rustling. There was just one problem. It was coming from right above my head. I looked up. The sunflower directly above me was tilted straight down. And this close, I saw it. Its head wasn't full of seeds. No, where the seeds should have been, there was just an abyss of pure black. And there were things between the petals and the abyss, white, sharp things, all pointed towards the center, teeth. I broke into a sprint. With both arms, I pushed the sunflowers out of the way, forcing myself through the field. "Derek!" I screamed, but all I heard was more rustling above my head. As all the sunflowers tilted towards me, as their mouths opened, rows and rows of sharp fangs, gleaming in the moonlight, descended towards me. Then something grabbed my arm. I was dragged through the fields, the foliage snapping and rustling underneath me. "Help!" I screamed, but as my legs kicked against the dirt, I realized I was powerless. As I was dragged to my death, I was staring up at the stars. I shot up. The thing clasped around my arm wasn't a sunflower, it was a hand. An old, wrinkled hand. I looked up to see a bowler hat and a dark suit. The old man from the farm stand. And there, several feet away from me in the dirt, was Derek. He was breathing hard, alive, but his right arm was covered in dark blood that spilled out into the soil. "I think it's time we talked," he said calmly as he let go of my arm. "I'm taking care of a local farm for a few weeks. They left me a strange set of rules." Part 4. "What were you thinking, going into the sunflowers?" the old man asked as he wound gauze around Derek's arm. "What were you thinking?" "I saw you go into the field, too," he replied. "I went behind the field to hide from the crazy man with a gun. You were lurking around out there at 2 a.m. What was I supposed to think?" Derek shot back, grimacing in pain. "And you," the old man said, pointing squarely at me. "You should have known that if he couldn't kill whatever was attacking him with a gun, going in after him was an idiot move." I wanted to save him," I said, arms crossed. "Oh, so you were armed, too?" "No." He shook his head. I caught the phrase "stupid kids" muttered under his breath. Then he took off his hat, set it in the middle of the table, and glanced at each of us. "I'm going to tell you what's going on here. And then, I hope, you can help me." Derek and I exchanged a glance. "How do we know we can trust you?" he asked. "He just saved our lives," I replied. "He was hanging around outside in the middle of the night, for no good reason." "It was a good reason," the old man snapped, glaring at Derek, "and if you just listened to me for a damn minute, you'd understand." "Come on," I whispered, squeezing Derek's hand. "Okay, fine." The old man straightened himself and then began to speak. "The Gershons started this farm almost 20 years ago. They bought the plot of land from an old widow who had lived here her entire life. She didn't want to sell it, but she needed the money. Well, they drew up the contract, but at the last moment, they changed the paperwork and tricked her into selling it for half the price. When she realized she'd been tricked, she cursed the land itself. But they just laughed. They didn't believe in curses or superstitions or the supernatural." The old man stopped and looked pointedly at Derek. He broke eye contact and looked at the floor. Of course, as soon as they planted the sunflower field, they realized the curse was very real. Eventually, they tried to sell the property, but by that time, news of the curse had spread, and they would only get a fraction of what they paid. They weren't willing to lose their money, so they kept it. And with time, they learned that if they followed certain rules and stayed careful, they could grow some crops and turn a profit. But no one is perfect. After some close calls, the Gershons decided they didn't want to risk their lives, but were perfectly fine with risking other people's lives. So they started hiring people to tend to the farm. They preyed on the weak, the disadvantaged, the desperate. Single mothers. Undocumented immigrants. People who were new to the town, who hadn't yet heard of the curse, or were too desperate to care. The deal was a good one, too, a share of the crops, a place to live, and decent pay. This is where I come in. My daughter was one of these people. She was a single mother. And I was terrible. He paused and swallowed as if swallowing emotion. But his face remained stoic. I wouldn't let her and her son stay with me when she was evicted from her apartment. I thought it would cause too much conflict with my wife, and I was trying so hard to make it work, but now I see that none of that mattered. He sucked in a breath. A few weeks later, she was hired by the Gershon, and neither she nor my grandson was ever seen again. Derek and I sat there in stunned silence. "I'm so sorry," I finally choked out. That's horrible." "Then help me get them back," he said, a pleading look in his eye. "Get them back? They're not dead." You see, I recognized the voice in the cornfield. It's the voice of my grandson. Silence fell over the three of us. Derek and I looked at each other. The old man must have noticed our confusion because he continued, "The victims aren't always killed. Sometimes they're transformed. Like my daughter and grandson in the cornfield. Or the scarecrow. Or the pigs." I clapped my hands over my mouth. "The pigs?" He nodded. No. I called the police. When I saw one. And they came, and I think tears burned my eyes. I think they killed him. I'm so sorry to hear that. But it's not your fault. The Gershons have a lot of power in this town. They have a deal with the police. Dirty cops have been known to get rid of evidence in the sunflower field. He sighed. I've devoted the past 3 years of my life to this. I've run into every obstacle and know everything there is to know. A lot of it I learned from the widow's children directly. So is there a way to get them back? The people who were transformed? I asked. Yes. I was never able to get into the house before. The Gershons made sure of that. But now, he reached into his pocket and pulled out what appeared to be a small mesh bag. Within, among what looked like dried plant material, I could make out something long and white, a bone. This is what the widow used to create the curse. Her daughter told me it was hidden behind the medicine cabinet in the bathroom, and there it was. Using this, I should be able to reverse the curse's effects. He glanced at Derek, and then back at me. "So, will you help me?" I paused, looking into the old man's blue eyes. And then I nodded. We began at dawn. The sun crested over the hill, sending long shadows over the path. The old man led us to the edge of the cornfield, which now in the daylight didn't look so ominous. The stalks swayed gently in the breeze, illuminated in gold from the rising sun. "Are you ready?" he asked. Derek and I stood several feet away as he lifted the bag. He recited several sentences of Latin or some other language, something he'd memorized in his research, I assumed. He nearly shouted the last sentence. Then he dumped the contents of the bag on the ground. The dried leaves scattered in the wind. The bone twirled in the air, then bounced into the dirt. For a minute, nothing happened. But then I heard it, a soft rustling from within the corn. Slowly, it grew louder and louder. I grabbed Derek's hand and squeezed it, bracing myself for some eldritch horror to come out, but it had worked. A woman walked out of the corn, tall and thin, holding hands with a smiling little boy. I watched, my eyes welling up with tears as the woman hugged her father. Then both of them hugged the little boy. "Come on," the old man said, wiping his eyes. "It's time for you to come home." The old man started down the driveway towards the main road with his daughter and his grandson in his wake. Dread twisted my gut. Something felt off. He was just leaving? Without looking for the others? Without even a glance in our direction? I scanned the farm. But I didn't see anyone emerging, didn't hear any voices. "Hey!" I called out. "What about the others?" The old man stopped and turned around. He wasn't smiling. "I'm sorry," he said. My heart sank further. "What do you mean, you're sorry?" "The curse can't be reversed," he said, his blue eyes glinting in the rising sunday. "The only way to free someone from the farm is to give someone in their place." No. He doesn't mean, "I'm sorry," the old man said. He put his arm around his daughter. She looked back at us with sadness in her eyes, holding her little boy's hand. And then he continued down the driveway. "Don't walk away," I screamed. "Emily," Derek started. "Come back here. Right now. Emily." This time, Derek's voice had an odd quality to it. It was muffled, raspy. I whipped around and froze. Straw was poking out of Derek's mouth. "No!" I screamed, stumbling over to him. But it was too late. His skin was sickly gray. His eyes were glassy and blank. And his lips, they almost looked like they'd been drawn on with marker. I watched in horror as the man I loved turned into a scarecrow. "Derek," I sobbed. "Please." His body was still above me. Arms stretched stiffly out at his sides. Flannel shirt stuffed with straw. Burlap's head hanging limply on his shoulders. And then he moved. His head swung wildly towards me. His eyes, now nothing more than buttons, fixed squarely on me. I ran. I ran as fast as I could towards the house. But I could feel something changing inside me. Everything felt off balance. My legs felt all wrong, bending and twisting underneath me. I stumbled inside and collapsed to the floor, crying. But I knew I was changing, too. For some reason, my changes are happening more slowly than Derek's. But when I look in the mirror, I can see the changes. My nose is longer. My ears are twisted. My skin is pinker. So I tried to type this up as quickly as I could. "Please, stay far away from Gershon Farm. Don't buy their stuff, don't go to work there, don't do anything. Run as fast as you can and never look back." I would say more, but it's getting harder to type. The space between my fingers is melting away. My hands are growing stiff. In just an hour or so, there will be hooves, and I will have no way of communicating with the outside world. So, please, whatever you do, don't come to Gershon Farm. My father's strange farm. I had to go back. It had been playing on my mind for the better part of 3 decades. I had tried to forget most of my time there, on the farm. They were mostly horrible memories, but bits and pieces of those horrible memories kept finding their way back to me as I grew older, and they left behind a question I needed answered. Could such terrible things exist in this world? I pulled into the dirt driveway that led to the house that had long since been abandoned. The two-story farmhouse sat on a small hill, dark and wistful. As I approached up the winding dirt driveway, I could see the dirty rotting wood and broken shutters hanging open from dark windows. That had been my home in the 1980s. I grew up there. I had left when I was 9. It was a small farm, only one cornfield. Small enough that my father could work it alone with some leased machinery. Though the land was small, he made a good amount of money from it. The farm was different. Strange. The land's ripe for growing, Dad had said to me once. He pulled a scarecrow from the equipment shed that sat next to the cornfield. There were 4 scarecrows, and Dad would set them up just after the field was sowed in the growing season. They would always go up in a diamond pattern. First one he would hammer in at the north end of the field, second one to the west end, third one to the east end, and fourth one to the south end. I had always wondered why he didn't hammer in the west end scarecrow last. It was closest to the house. But things had their order on that farm. You see, Dad said, it's a special land. Real special. Yields are off the charts for the size of the field. Stop checking that football about and listen up, Timmy. I did what he said and followed behind him closely as he dragged the scarecrow to the south end of the field. The butt of the scarecrow's stake dragged through the dirt, kicking up dust. I listened carefully to Dad. When he told you something, he only spoke kindly once. If he had to tell you twice. This is going to be your farm one day, Dad said. He drove the scarecrow's stake into the ground. So, soon, not this harvest season, but maybe the next, I'm going to start teaching you of how things work around here. Little by little. He then hammered the top of the stake that ran up the back of the scarecrow like a spine. I flinched at each of the 4 cracking shots. When he was done, he wiped the sweat off his brow and turned to me, his brooding figure silhouetted by the low afternoon sun. This land's good, Timmy. Real good, he smiled, with a twinge of a wild look in his eye. You just need the right fertilizer. With that, he started back towards the house. I stood there for a moment, staring up at the scarecrow, its featureless straw face framed by a hood fashioned out of a ragged burlap sack. Stray strands of straw poking from its head fluttered in the gentle breeze. Something in my stomach churned over. I never did like those things. I popped the trunk of my rental car, pulled out a shovel, then closed the trunk again. I looked out over the field. It was barren now, the soil untouched for decades. The equipment shed was far to my right, on the east side of the field. It was as decrepit as the house. The roof had partially caved in and the wall planks were warped in places. An iron chain fastened by 2 heavy-duty padlocks locked the doors. I swallowed hard. I prayed they were not in there. I started toward the farmhouse. The pylons were still out. On afternoons in the growing season, when the scarecrows were in the field and just as the sun turned orange and started its descent to the horizon, Dad would hammer in 10 4-foot wooden pylons around the house and then take them down first thing in the morning. Each pylon had carvings on them, strange symbols that looked similar to what you would see on a totem pole. What are those? I had asked once. I'll tell you one day. You're not ready to know, yet. When the pylons and scarecrows were out, Dad had a strict rule. I had to come inside when the bottom of the sun touched the horizon. One afternoon I had spent too long playing outside. The sun was a big orange semicircle peeking over the horizon line, but I did not care that day. I was having too much fun and was feeling a tad rebellious. So, I played. I was chucking Hail Mary passes to myself down the driveway. In my head, I was the star QB of my favorite team, the New England Patriots. I always wanted to be like Dan Marino, and even though he was a Dolphin player and a division rival, he was still my favorite player. The high-flying, gunslinging star QB that could chuck the ball 80 yards through the air. Yeah, that was me in my dreams. But the reality was I never had the talent for the game, unfortunately. But that afternoon, for a short while, with the rambunctious imagination of a 9-year-old, I was king. I heaved the ball in the air and took off underneath it. Timmy Brentwood throws the pass high and long. I shouted. I watched the wobbly spiral descend, and at full sprint, I stuck out my hands, bobbled the ball, and then caught it. He's got it. He's at the 10, the 5, touchdown Patriots. I spiked the ball into the dirt. Timothy Brentwood throws the last-second winning touchdown pass in the Super Bowl. The greatest quarterback to ever dash Timmy, my father said sternly from the porch. Reality came crashing back. What's the rule? Inside before sundown. Get a move on. Anger suddenly burned at the base of my chest. He was always ordering me around. I was always doing what he wanted. Always had to listen to him. He never listened to me. I was always meek and good and followed his orders. I never got what I wanted, so he could get screwed as far as I was concerned. Just this once, I wanted to play. No, I don't want to, I said, with all the misplaced confidence of a rebellious child. I want to keep playing. Dad stomped down the porch steps with purpose. He spoke through gritted teeth, his veins and tendons bulging from his neck. If I have to go out there and get you, boy. My heart froze. The confidence and anger melted away as quickly as it came. I was only scared, now. I started back to the house, running past the pylons that Dad had erected earlier in the afternoon. At the base of the porch steps, he grabbed me by my wrist and hauled me up without my feet touching the wood. He put me back down on the porch and grasped my shoulders tightly. He dropped his face to mine, his piercing gaze flaring with a ferocious intensity. You listen to me when I tell you to do something, boy. Then I got a hard clip over the ear. My ear went numb and rang with a high-pitched whir. My eyes swelled with tears. I looked at him stunned. It was not the first time I had been hit, but it was the first time I had been hit over the head. Now go to bed, right now. Without supper. Without saying anything, I ran inside, up the steps, slammed my door, and curled under the covers. I buried my face into the pillow, and only then did I sob. I walked past the pylons that had remained for all these years. Some still stood, others had toppled over. They were old now, blackened with mold and withered, the wood split, and the carvings faded. I walked up the porch steps that moaned their old age. For a moment I stood at the front door, tears stinging the back of my eyes. It was not the house I had come back for. It was what was in the field I needed to see, but it was the home I wanted to see because, through the bad memories, there was still some good. The hinges whined as I pushed the door open. The house was as I remembered, untouched from that last dreadful night I spent here all those years ago, the night we had to flee. Only now, the home was caked with dust and mold. Cobwebs had collected in the corners. The wallpaper had peeled in large sheets off the wall. All these artifacts of neglect and abandonment. The TV was still there, grayed with thick dust. Tears streamed down my face as I stood in the living room, the furniture standing around me like ruins. Every Sunday morning we would sit together there. I got to watch Looney Tunes on the TV as Dad would sit in his recliner reading the paper or a book, and Mom would make us her famous pancakes. No one could or ever will make them like Mom could. They were thick and fluffy, served with a generous drenching of maple syrup. If we were especially lucky, she would add chocolate chips to the batter and serve with a dollop of ice cream. That was the best. When she was done cooking, she would come through from the kitchen with 2 plates stacked high with pancakes. She would give one to Dad with a kiss, and one to me with a peck on the cheek. Then she would get her plate and join us in the living room. I would cuddle up next to her on the sofa, and we would sit together to enjoy her pancakes and watch cartoons. It was the one time during the week that everything did not feel so cold. The one time Dad did not feel so distant. The one time I was not scared of him. The one time he would have a conversation with Mom and me, instead of talking in short and simple bursts or barking out orders. The one time we were a real family. I wiped my tears with my sleeve and walked outside, leaving the home behind for the last time. I waded out into the field, the soil hard beneath my boots. I could feel the field spirit. With some satisfaction, I felt it was weak. Dad had called it special. I would call it evil. The night Dad had sent me to bed with a clip over the ear and no supper, Mom had come up with some soup and a glass of soda. She handed it to me with a kiss on the forehead. "A mother can't let her child go hungry," she said. "It goes against all my nature." "Thanks, Mommy. I know he's rough, Timmy, but try not to get too mad at him. He worries for you, that's all. I don't care. I hate him." She sighed and looked away, then ruffled my hair and smiled at me. "He does what he can to provide. Just leave the bowl and glass on the nightstand. I'll come in later and take it to the kitchen." She got up and walked to the door, pausing to say, "I love you." "Love you too, Mommy," I said. And she left the room. Later in the night, I had awoken suddenly. I sat bolt upright. My football. I had left it outside that afternoon. It was my only ball, and it was just sitting out there, plain as day down the driveway. If one of the older kids, the neighbors from a few miles down the road, saw it the next morning, they would surely steal it, if they had not already. And if they stole it, Dad would not buy me another. I could already hear his lecture in my head. Let it be a lesson learned. If you don't take care of your things, they won't take care of you, he would always say. I crept to my door, eased it open, and peeked around the corner to my parents' room down the hall. The door was shut, and the house was dark and quiet. Perfect. I crept down the stairs and tiptoed to the kitchen, where Dad kept the front door keys in one of the drawers. I grabbed them, and then, dipping in and out of the moonlight that flooded through the windows, I tiptoed to the front door. I eased back the deadbolts as slowly and quietly as I could. They drew back with a faint click. I waited nervously after each one clicked back, listening for my parents' door to fly open with my father's heavy footsteps tumbling out like a madman. But they never came. I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. My ball sat 15 yards away, looking lonely in the driveway. I was prepared to make a mad dash for it. Run over, pick it up, run back, lock the doors, sneak back upstairs, and go to bed. Dad would be none the wiser. But before I could take off down the driveway, I was distracted by a rustling noise coming from the cornfield to my left. The cornstalks were about 6 foot by then, and shining a pale green under the moonlight. A man's muffled scream came from the corn. My heart leaped. The corn was restless. The stalks rustled back and forth in the center of the field, and then came another muffled scream. I froze, and my knees became watery. The scarecrows. They were not in their usual spots. They were close together, in the center of the cornfield, their hooded heads poking out over the top of the stalks. And they were moving. The corn rustled violently, as did the scarecrows. They moved about wildly, as if they were wrestling with something. Another muffled scream. I watched wide-eyed and frozen with terror as the scarecrows fought with something among the cornstalks. I thought that this was surely a bad dream. A terrible dream. A nightmare. And, in a sense, it was a nightmare, just not the kind you can wake up from. The muffled scream cut off abruptly. The scarecrows froze for a moment, their hoods ruffling gently in the breeze. They craned their heads, and their straw faces featureless, but somehow ingrained with hatred, settled on me. I was seeing something I should not be seeing. A shiver trickled down my spine. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called. Caw-caw. 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 I was just about to scream when a hand grasped the back of my pajama collar and pulled me backward into the house. I was flung to the ground by Dad. He stepped around me and slammed the door shut, then locked the two deadbolts. They drew shut with an emphatic shunk. I waited for Dad to turn around with a look of rage, but what I saw scared me worse. He had looked at me, not with rage, but terror. It was the first time I had seen him scared, and I would see him this scared only once more, just a few weeks later. I started to cry. Seeing him scared had scared me more than his rage ever could have. "It's okay," he said shakily. "You're okay, Timmy." He bent down and scooped me up. He carried me to my room as I cried, and he took me into bed, saying one thing repeatedly: "You're okay, Timmy. You're okay." A murder of crows flew overhead, moving strangely silent. I stood in the middle of the field. The once rich soil is now sick. Up close I could see it had taken on a grayish hue. And there was something else, too. It was rumbling slightly as if it were hungry. I readied my shovel and paused. I asked myself, do I want to do this? What purpose did it serve? What would it change? Nothing. So why had I come back? Closure, that was why. I could not move on if I did not have closure, nor could I heal. The nightmares would continue, the anxiety would persist, and my soul would continue to whittle and seep from wounds that wandering fingers of doubt kept prodding open. I had to see if it was all real. I could not let questions linger. Could such horror exist in this world, or were my memories simply warped and exaggerated with time? So, did I want to do this? Yes. The answer was always yes. I should have come back years ago. Maybe then I would not have suffered so long. Closure, that is what I needed. I pierced the soil with my shovel. My door had burst open in the middle of the night. Dad was in the doorway, a rifle slung over his shoulder. "We need to go," he said. I sat up groggily. "What?" "We need to go." He pulled me out from under the blanket. "What's going on, Dad?" "We need to go." "Why?" He pulled me along at his side as we rushed down the stairs. His deep wrinkles and tanned skin, his strong jaw and sunken eyes, his pointed nose and thin lips, all twisted in an expression of terror. Terror like what had plastered his face the night he had caught me outside after dark, only worse. I started to cry. "Dad, where is Mom?" "I thought I did everything right," he said absently. "I don't know what I did wrong. The pylons, maybe?" The front door was already hanging open when he dragged me through it. Outside, the corn was restless again. "I don't know what I did wrong," Dad said. "I don't know how I didn't hear them come in. Dad dragged me to the pickup truck in the driveway. A woman's muffled screams came from the corn. I looked over my shoulder toward the field to see the hooded heads bobbing around wildly again. "Dad, where's Mom?" I said with increasing urgency. I thought I did everything right. I don't know why it went wrong. He opened the pickup's passenger door and threw me inside. "Dad, where is Mom?" I screamed. He shut the door in my face. He walked around the front of the pickup, and for a moment he paused to look back at the field and the scarecrows. The shotgun trembled in his hands. For what it is worth, I think he would have tried to save her if it was not for me. He continued around the car and climbed into the front seat. He fumbled with the keys in his trembling hands before inserting and turning them. The engine rumbled to life. "Dad, tell me, where's Mom?" He reversed suddenly, swinging the car around so the front end pointed down the driveway, away from the house. He slammed the stick into first gear and took off with a lurch. The dirt clattered the underneath of the truck as we went. "Where's Mom?" I cried shrilly. He began to sob. "I'm sorry. I don't know what I did. I thought I did everything right. I'm sorry, Tim. I'm sorry, Sarah. Oh God, Sarah, I'm so sorry." I cowered back into my seat, feeling the car bounce over the bumpy road as we fled. My father cried, and so did I as we drove off into the night, leaving the farm and Mom behind. I tossed aside the first clump of soil. Underneath the topsoil, the dirt was gray and pale as bone. I continued to dig, tossing the soil in a heap to the side, where it trembled subtly. Then I hit something with a hollow thud. I threw away the shovel and got to my knees. I reached into the hole and brushed aside the dirt. I uncovered what I expected, yet feared at the same time. A human skull. I plucked it from the dirt and held it up with shaking hands. The hollow eye socket stared vacantly back at me. I put it aside and reached into the hole again. I clawed at the dirt frantically with my bare hands. There were more bones. Skulls. Hands. Femurs. I pawed and pawed at the dirt. I dug until my fingernails were torn clean off. It was true. It was all true. There is evil in this world. My memories had not lied. I fell back on my ass, exhausted, terrified, and despaired. A pile had formed around me. So many skulls. So many bones. All from the souls that had fed the soil. I worked on a body farm. Christmas Day 1999 was, and will likely remain, the most terrifying day of my life. I was a young woman, pursuing my dream of forensic anthropology at Boston University under Professor Menace. He was my mentor, intelligent, tenured, and inspiring. Our class had taken trips to his body farm in upstate New York a few times throughout the semester. It consisted of a variety of environments that were perfect for studying various rates of decomposition: dense woods, thick brush, open fields, ponds, creeks, sheds, cabins, and even a swampy marsh. In the center of it all was the Menace home, an ancient yet beautiful colonial tucked beneath the massive pines. On the last day of classes before winter break, Professor Menace gently grabbed my arm as I was leaving his lecture and asked me to sit with him for a few moments. As we sat and sipped coffee, he asked what my plans were for the holidays. The question was unexpected, but not off-putting. I told him that I was going to stay with my friend Jess. He asked why I wasn't spending it with family, and I went on to explain that I had grown up in the foster system. He apologized profusely, for which I told him it was okay. Professor Manis took another drink and told me that he would be spending Christmas, as well as the remainder of winter, with his sister's family in Florida, leaving his estate and the body farm vacant. I smiled softly as I realized what he was about to inquire. "You're the top student in class by far. How would you like to work on the Manis body farm this winter as part of your PhD program and continue my research while I am down south?" he asked. Christmas with the corpses. I couldn't have said yes faster. If only I had known the horrors that were awaiting me. I pulled down the long, gravel drive in my old Civic and the mansion came into view. It was even more beautiful in the snow. I parked the car, walked to the front door, and unlocked it with the large, brass key Professor Manis had given me. I was beaming. There were 5 specimens planted on the property that I was to study. Subject 1, female, elderly, 36 months deceased, field. Subject 2, male, adult, 2 months deceased, sealed barrel outside of shed. Subject 3, female, elderly, 8 months decreased, inside shed under a tarp. Subject 4, male, young adult, 13 months deceased, dry creek bed. Subject 5, female, young adult, 2 weeks deceased, bank of pond, submerged. I gave each specimen a nickname based on their location. There was Fiona Field, Barry Barrel, Sheila Shed, Craig Creek, and Polly Pond. Immature and unprofessional? Maybe, but it helped me keep track and made the morbid reality a little easier to deal with. To be honest, the work was easy, quick, and uneventful. Unfortunately, this did not last long. Each morning at 9 a.m. I would make my rounds and note each specimen's current stage of decomposition, as well as any signs of wildlife interference. It was solemn and a bit eerie, but I was doing good work that would help the criminal justice system and forensic scientists. At least, that's what I told myself. Things had become routine by the 3rd day. I would put on my latex gloves and medical mask, followed by my snow gear. Most of the specimens could be studied visually from a short distance, except Barry Barrel and Sheila Shed, whom I would have to examine physically due to their respective shelters. The subjects were decomposing at their expected rates. All but one. I walked to the edge of the pond and stared at Polly, frozen beneath the ice. Her head seemed to rest comfortably on the bank, while her eyes remained a blank slate gazing towards the winter sky. Polly's feet were a blur of white as they stretched toward the depths. The scene was almost peaceful, as if she was merely a statue resting beneath the glass, perfectly preserved in her display case. I stared at Polly's naked body, ready to jot down my notes. My eyes descended from her head to her neck, breasts, abdomen, and finally down to the thin, dark strip of hair between her thighs. I stepped back as an unexpected sensation pulsated through my body. I felt embarrassed. Her nude body reminded me of my own, and I felt an impulse to cover her. I laughed awkwardly to myself and scribbled the remainder of my notes. Satisfied with my morning's work, I trudged up the snowy hill towards the house to make breakfast. I spent the remainder of the day working on my thesis and watching local television. As the sun set, I drew a bath to unwind. I rested against the back of the clawfoot tub and closed my eyes, soaking the day off of my skin. For a brief moment, my head submerged under the warm water and an image of Polly's pale skin and milky eyes flashed in my mind. I shot up out of the tub, angry with myself for falling asleep. As I began to dry off, a loud thud outside broke the quiet stillness of the night. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, but my sense of logic and reason wouldn't allow me. Instead, I concluded that it must have been local wildlife. I was miles away from any other person, and no one in their right mind would be rummaging about the property in the cold at night. My attempt to calm myself was failing. I quietly crept down the creaky stairs and made my way to the sliding glass door at the back of the home. I slid it open and examined the property with my flashlight. All remained still beside the light, falling snow. I decided that I would investigate in the morning as I closed and locked the door. Looking at the clock, I reasoned that it wasn't too late to call Jess, selfishly knowing her voice would make me feel less alone. We spoke for an hour before I went to bed with all of the lights on. That night I dreamt of red flowers blooming through the white snow. The following morning was dreary and still. I brewed coffee and listened to the news. A storm was coming and projected to hit on Christmas Day. After breakfast, I geared up and began my rounds. Almost immediately, I saw what had made the loud noise in the night. The barrel near the shed had fallen over, and Barry's stiff, decomposing arm reached out toward the fresh snow. I approached cautiously. All seemed plausible at first, figuring the barrel must have toppled from wind or wildlife. Professor Manus had warned me of local coyotes and their appetite for human remains and bones. I pulled the barrel upright and inspected Barry. As soon as I saw his hand, my heart began to pound in my chest. The nails of his index, middle, and ring fingers had been pushed back as if he had clawed at something. I grabbed the barrel's lid from the snow and ran my fingers along the grain. Towards the center, I noticed 3 symmetrical scratches. I felt like I was going to vomit. I sealed the lid and began to think. I told myself it was the result of the barrel toppling over. His hand fell towards the lid and the momentum caused the lacerations when his nails made contact with the wood. It made sense. There was nothing to worry about. I continued with my rounds. The specimens appeared intact and unmoved, giving me a sense of peace and security until I came to the edge of the pond. I could see Polly as I approached and immediately felt as though something wasn't right. I crouched down and examined her body once again. There was no embarrassment this time. I sat along the bank for a few minutes before it hit me. Polly looked like she was closer than she was the day prior. I quickly grabbed my measuring tape and extended it toward the icy corpse. Her head was 2 inches closer to the bank than it was the day before. The nausea and panic returned in full force, and my mind began to race for an explanation. "It's fine," I repeated to myself. Temperatures change and the water beneath the ice is still fluid. The corpse simply shifted in the night. I started to feel better and laughed at myself for being frightened. The solitude was simply getting to me. I finished my notes for the day and retired to the house. It was Christmas Eve. I deserved a little bit of fun. After lunch, I put on a Christmas record and made eggnog. The house felt warm and alive. I found it a welcome change from the usual eerie stillness. A few drinks later, I was finally feeling relaxed. I began rummaging through the Manus home in search of Christmas decor. I found myself at the basement door before remembering the professor's strict instruction to keep it closed and stay out. Half an hour later, I was satisfied with the 2 wreaths and strands of tinsel I discovered in a storage closet near the guest room. I melted into the couch with a freshly refilled glass, and my eyes grew heavy as Sinatra's rendition of Silent Night served as a lullaby. Just before I drifted off, 3 loud knocks at the back door jolted me awake. I wasn't able to explain this. I felt adrenaline pulse through my body. Maybe I had drifted instantly into a dream the second I closed my eyes. This idea was shattered as 3 more knocks rapped the glass of the sliding door. I dug down to the floor and contemplated my next move. The door was locked, I was sure of it. I knew then the best idea was to make a dash to the phone and call the police. Just before I took off, a muffled voice from the other side of the glass spoke. "LYSS, open the door, bitch." I could have died if I hadn't started laughing so hard. Jess had come to surprise me. I unlocked the door and slid it open, nearly killing her with a hug. My eyes welled with tears at the realization that she had traveled to the Manus farm in the snow just to spend Christmas with me. After catching up and a few more drinks, Jess proclaimed that this wonderful evening would most certainly not be right without a Christmas tree. Warmed from alcohol and our snow gear, we decided to head into the woods to chop down a small pine before the sunset. As we neared the shed, I thought of an idea that, at the time, believed would be hilariously brilliant. I told Jess to go into the shed and grab the axe under the tarp since I had to check on one of the bodies in the back. I remember her distinctly saying, "As long as I don't have to see one of those things, I'm happy." I sat back and grinned ear to ear, waiting for Jess' screams as she would soon discover Sheila under the tarp. The screams never came. Instead, Jess emerged from the shed with the axe and said, "I didn't see any tarp, but the axe was leaning against the wall by the door." You know, for such a smart girl, you've got a shitty memory. I put on my best fake smile and bantered with her. My mind silently raced. She must have missed it, that's all. It's a dark shed. I'll check in the morning before the storm hits and all of the bodies will be fine. We proceeded into the woods until we found the perfect little tree to chop down and drag back home. The night consisted of even more drinks, a little cannabis, and old memories. It was more than enough to help ease my anxiety. Jess and I eventually retired to the master bedroom and fell asleep as soon as our heads hit our respective pillows. The next morning blessed me with the Christmas hangover from hell. After a gallon of coffee, fried eggs, and bacon, I suited up for my routine 25-minute workday. Groggier than usual, I shuffled through the fresh powder towards the shed. The snow was starting to pick up and I knew I didn't have much time. When the shed came into view, I couldn't believe what my eyes were seeing. The barrel had toppled over once again, but this time the corpse within was nowhere to be seen. I ran inside the shed, and just as I feared, there was no tarp and no Sheila. I sprinted to the field and dry-creek bed, both of which were absent of their deceased inhabitants. Racing down the hill to the pond, I stopped and vomited when I reached the bank. Polly was gone as well. All that remained was a perfect, body-shaped cavity in the ice. My adrenaline was back in full swing as I beelined to the back door of the Manus home. Jess was smoking on the couch and nursing her booze flu. My frazzled appearance got her attention and she asked me if I was okay. I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed the phone and frantically dialed the number that Dr. Manus had given me, which instantly went to an answering machine. Through my broken words, I was eventually able to articulate that all of the bodies had gone missing. Jess began to pelt me with questions, none of which I was able to answer. As the winter storm raged outside, Jess and I came to the grim conclusion that our only option was to lock ourselves in and wait it out. Few words were spoken as several hours flew by. The storm continued to increase in intensity as the gray, winter sun set beyond the tree line. Jess and I continued to comfort one another as night fell, telling ourselves that we would wait out the storm and leave first thing in the morning. We triple-checked the doors and windows and kept the fire and the burning in the hearth. We felt secure and warm. This was short-lived as a loud crash hit the roof and the lights went out. I heard Jess wince in the darkness and I held her close. I whispered that it was okay and the storm must have broken a tree branch outside. We made our way to the kitchen and grabbed the flashlights from under the sink. Jess suggested that we should check the fuse box, and I reminded her that the basement was off limits. Annoyed, Jess hissed that she preferred to not freeze to death on Christmas Day in a creepy body farm mansion. It was a compelling argument. A wave of musty air hit me as we opened the basement door and descended the stone stairs. I pleaded with Jess to be quick as we scanned the walls with our flashlights. Something about the basement didn't feel right, and I wished at that moment that I could be anywhere else. Jess walked over to the breaker and flipped them to no avail. As she worked, my eye was drawn to a stack of photos on a wooden table in the corner. I began to tremble as I flipped through them. All of the photos were of me, candid and dating back to my first year at the university. My voice cracked as I called Jess over to look. She looked me in the eye and said, "We have to leave now." I silently agreed. We scaled the stairs as fast as we could and shut it, only to be greeted by a snow-covered Dr. Manis sitting on a chair in the foyer. A shotgun rested lazily next to him. I nervously spewed words and sentence fragments, telling him that we only went into the basement to look for the breaker, followed by a procession of confused questions as to why he wasn't in Florida. "I got your message, you worry me, Alicia," was his only response. Grabbing the Shogun, he motioned Jess and me towards the front door. We obeyed without hesitation. "Why are you here?" Jess asked as we marched in the blistering snow. "I heard my specimens are missing," Manis hissed. The beam of our flashlights struggled to cut through the darkness, but I knew we were nearing the shed through muscle memory. The crunching snow quieted as a wide-eyed Jess stopped dead in her tracks. "What's the problem?" an annoyed Professor Manis asked. Jess did not respond and continued to stare, all color draining from her face. I pointed my flashlight ahead and saw them, the silhouettes of 5 familiar humanoid beings standing completely still in the snow. Manis whispered it worked as he ripped the flashlight from my hand and slowly continued towards the row of figures. Jess quietly grabbed my arm and pointed to the pickup truck keys clipped to his belt. Jess and I shook our heads in silent agreement. "Incredible," Manis proclaimed as he approached them. He couldn't have been more than 15 feet away. I squeezed Jess' hand tightly. It was now or never. I lunged forward and grabbed the keys as Jess pushed Manis down onto his face. The shotgun fired as it made contact with the ground, blowing a hole through the chest of the corpse directly in front of him. The flashlight beam shot through the torso like sunlight escaping the clouds. "Run!" Jess yelled, snapping me out of shock. I turned and followed her towards the house. Manis screamed incoherently as he struggled to find his footing. Another shotgun blast sounded as speeding BBs whistled past my ear. I screamed. I looked back momentarily as Manis shrieked at the top of his lungs. In a split second, I saw the corpses descend on him like pigs at a trough. Manis tried to shout once more, but merely choked as his mouth filled with blood. Jess fumbled with the keys as we climbed into the 4x4. We were both bawling our eyes as we fishtailed down the gravel drive towards the main road. The next few months were filled with police interrogations, interviews, and an official resignation from the university. The official record states that the Manis estate and farm were abandoned. The specimens on record, as well as Manis himself, were never discovered. The Christmas season is approaching again. It is always a difficult time of year for Jess and I. I've never had the confidence to share my story with others, but now I think it is crucial should I disappear. You see, I found a handwritten note in my mailbox yesterday. There was no postage, return address, or signature. The note simply read, "It's time to finish our study.